Oh, MiHoYo knows these angles, alright. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Crypt13 and today we're going to be doing a breakdown on Yoimiya. If you guys are a returning viewer, you know what to expect from these kinds of videos, and if you're new around here, I'm going to be doing a breakdown of her entire kit and give you some potential builds along with some preliminary calculations. Do note that this is not a comprehensive list of every single build that you can make with Yoimiya, because I'm pretty sure that I might miss a couple. And so if I did miss a particular build, then please drop a comment down below. Everything in this video is also based on data mined information, so the numbers, scaling, and abilities, they can change slightly. However, Yoimiya is technically already in the game because we can trial her in her story quest, so I very highly doubt that a lot of things are going to change. Yoimiya is a very interesting character that kind of fills lots of different kinds of roles. A lot of people are comparing her to Hu Tao because their E-skills function very similarly, but that's really the only thing that's the same. And so with that, let's jump into some potential builds you can make with Yoimiya. We'll first start with very classic builds, and the first one is a 2-piece Gladiator or a 2-piece Shiminawa to give you 18% attack percent bonus, as well as a 2-piece Crimson Witch, giving us 15% pyro damage bonus. This is a very run-of-the-mill classic set that is pretty good if you have really good substats on those artifact pieces already. If you're not really in the mood to farm for an entirely new set, you can borrow some artifacts from other characters that are wearing these artifacts already and just throw them onto Yoimiya. The next one is also pretty classic, and it's just a 4-piece Bolide set if you want to run Yoimiya with a shielder like Zhongli, or if you want to run double Geo on the team. The next one is a 4-piece Crimson Witch set if you already have this set farmed and you just really don't want to farm for a new artifact set. You can definitely go for this one. We'll be showing the differences between all these artifact sets when we go on to the calculations phase, so that you can make the decision on whether or not you think that the damage difference between the artifacts is actually worth it or not. The next one is a Lava Walker set, and with this one you don't want to be creating any elemental reactions, you just want to go full on pyro damage. So what you're looking for here is a lot of elemental shred and elemental damage bonus. An Animo character and Bennett could be really good choices for a team comp with this setup. The last artifact set build we can go with is a 4-piece Shiminawa set, but there are a lot of caveats with this one, and I'll explain them later on. But at a high level, this does give you the highest damage bonus and attack power, but you're going to have a very hard time generating enough energy to cast your elemental burst. And so with those artifact builds, we can go for a team that is focused on Vaporize, but this could be difficult since Yoimiya's normal attacks are pretty fast. Since Xingqiu is usually the enabler for this type of team comp, if Yoimiya's attacks are a little bit too quick, or if her pyro application is too large, then we might accidentally end up vaporizing with Xingqiu instead of Yoimiya, and we don't want that. Or a team that focuses on melt damage, however it won't be Yoimiya that creates the melt reaction, but instead a cryo character like Rosaria. The next team comp that we can go with is an overload comp with the likes of either Fischl or Beidou. You might want to consider some form of CC like Venti or Kazuha, because depending on the types of enemies, overload is going to push them back and it's just going to get really annoying. So if you really want to focus on Yoimiya's E skill and her normal attacks, these are definitely the ways you should go. Now if you want to play Yoimiya more for her elemental burst and more as a sub DPS, then the artifact set that you would want to consider is running the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate, or a 2-piece Noblesse with 2-piece Crimson Witch, or a 2-piece Noblesse with a 2-piece Gladiator or Shiminawa. Yoimiya is definitely designed to use all of her skills, but this one puts more emphasis on her elemental burst damage. I personally think that you want to strike a balance between her E skill and her elemental burst. Alright, now let's move on to Yoimiya's skills. Her base attack is on the same level as Keqing's, which is lower than the likes of Diluc, Eula, Xiao, Ayaka, and Ganyu, so her base attack is considered more average than most other 5 stars. Yoimiya's passive ascension stat is also crit rate, giving you a natural 20% 30% at around Ascension Phase 5 and around 25% at the final Ascension Phase. So let's first start with Yoimiya's normal attacks. It definitely looks like she's based around her normal attacks because her E skill directly enhances it. Even though her charge shot has a neat little gimmick behind it, her optimal damage definitely looks like it's going to be coming from using her normal attacks. And we'll talk about her charge shot gimmick in just a little bit. She's a pretty unique bow user because she fires off 2 arrows with 1 attack in her combos. Technically, Venti does that too, but no one really ever uses Venti's normal attacks, so I wouldn't blame you if you didn't know that. The first and fourth hit of her combo are double hits. The total base scaling on her normal attacks is the highest of any bow character currently in the game, Yoimiya's charged attack. So every single bow user in the game has a scaling of 198.4% on their fully aimed charge shot at talent level 8. So basically this means that every single bow character has the same scaling on their fully aimed charge shot, no matter if you're a 4-star or a 5-star. However, Yoimiya does get a neat little gimmick on her charged attack. It's very similar to Child's Riptide in that it fires 3 homing arrows that will be fired along with her charge shot and deals pyro damage. The scaling on this is pretty weak, so this charge shot pales in comparison to Ganyu's charge shot. It's basically on the level of Child's, but just a little bit stronger. Now, I don't want to tell you guys how to play, but you'll definitely not be dealing the most optimal damage if you use her charged shots a lot. Most of Yoimiya's damage is going to come from her enhanced normal attacks during her E skill. But if the internal cooldown on her charge shot and kindling arrows are separate, and if MiHoYo decides to make some exceptions around this move, then we can make this move pretty good with Overloaded. For example, Ganyu can melt both hits of her charge attack. So if MiHoYo lists the restriction on Overload, only being able to proc damage every 0.5 seconds by a character, she can instantly get 2 Overload procs with her charge attack if the main arrow and kindling arrow have separate internal cooldown timers. And it would be made even better if each kindling arrow had separate timers, as well as if they didn't apply much pyro, allowing all 3 kindling arrows to proc an elemental reaction. I don't think this is gonna happen, but it's pretty fun to think about and speculate. And at the time of recording this video, I know that Yoimiya's story quest is available, but I haven't had the time to actually get there and test this stuff myself. And so even though this is not her greatest source of damage, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use it though. If you want to play Yoimiya 100% on the field, you'll need to find something to do while her E skill is on cooldown, so this is what you would use. It could also be really good for breaking shields. Next up, Yoimiya's E skill. This skill is very similar to Hu Tao in that it is going to enhance her normal attacks. Her arrows become infused with pyro, and the scaling on them gets stronger. Unlike Hu Tao, Yoimiya doesn't lose any HP, nor does she actually get a flat attack bonus. It simply just increases the scaling on her normal attacks. Also know that you lose the kindling arrow effect on your charge attacks, so there's basically no reason to be using your charge attack while you are using your E skill. So the scaling and damage modifier for the skill might be confusing to some people, so let me try to explain it. The skill behaves very similarly to Razor's burst and its wolf companion damage, so if you are familiar with that, this works almost the same way. Unlike Razor's, this is not a separate damage instance, but rather this enhances the damage of each individual arrow. The math for this is actually quite simple. We take each scaling of her normal attack and simply multiply it by the percent listed. For example, we can take the scaling of her first normal attack here at level 8 and multiply it by the multiplier of her E skill here at level 8 as well. So the scaling on her first normal attack is 56.29%. So what we do here is multiply that by the scaling listed here, and what we end up with is 87.77%. And since this is a double hit, simply multiply that by 2 and we arrive at a new scaling of about 175.44%. And similarly for the second hit of her normal attack at talent level 8 is 108%, so we multiply that by the damage modifier and we end up with a new value of 168.31%. For the second hit of her normal attack combo. So hopefully that makes sense. And with this skill, her normal attacks has the highest total scaling of every character in the game, and it's also going to be very fast because there's very little hit lag with both characters. The uptime on this skill is also very much like Hu Tao. When she pops the skill, the cooldown begins immediately, and since the mode lasts for 10 seconds, there will be at least 8 seconds of downtime for the skill. Now let's move on to Yoimiya's Elemental Burst. So her Elemental Burst only works for her party members, except for the initial hit. So first, Yoimiya will deal AoE pyro damage and mark a single enemy that was hit with the Elemental Burst. After that, all normal charged plunging attacks, elemental skills, or elemental bursts that hit that enemy will trigger an explosion that deals AoE pyro damage, and this can occur once every 2 seconds. This is pretty much all sources of another character's damage except for things that come from weapon passives, probably. For example, Prototype Archaic and other passives that are similar to that. If an enemy is defeated while the mark is still active, then it will pass on to another nearby enemy. That mark lasts 10 seconds. The burst has a 15-second cooldown with a 60 energy cost, so it has a pretty average cost and has a pretty decent uptime. The total scaling for this move, if all explosions trigger, is about 1200% at talent level 8, including the initial AoE pyro damage. Make sure not to sleep on this elemental burst, do not ignore it. This is another burst that deals damage while the character who casted it is off field. These types of bursts are basically like having 2 characters on the field simultaneously. Characters with the ability to do that always get extra points from me because usually they end up being pretty good. This is why characters like Xingqiu and Xiangling are really good. But of course, I understand people want to play Yoimiya on the field as much as they can, but I do have to say that her kit is designed so that she does both. She can function as a main DPS with her E skill and as an enabler with her elemental burst. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is going to directly affect the usage on the 4-piece Shiminawa set, and we'll go over that when we go over her calculations. So you may have noticed a distinct lack of AoE damage. She only has AoE damage on her elemental burst, and you might say that other characters don't really have AoE on their normal attacks or charge attacks either, but melee characters have the advantage of having a sweeping hitbox on their moves. So although in their text descriptions it doesn't say AoE, they can still deal damage to multiple enemies at once if the positioning is correct. However, with bows and arrows, you absolutely cannot hit multiple enemies with a single arrow, no matter the positioning of the enemies. The arrow can only collide with one single hurt box because that's just kind of how arrow collision works, as opposed to a sweeping hitbox from a sword, claymore, or polearm. For example, a charge attack from Hu Tao, if the enemies are lined up correctly, you can hit multiple at once. But with a single arrow, even if the enemies are right next to each other, that arrow is still only going to collide with one enemy, even if the 2 enemies are literally almost on top of each other. So please do be wary of this lack of AoE damage from Yoimiya's normal attacks. Now let's move on to her passive skills. Her first passive skill is, during her E skill, when her normal attacks hit enemies, she will increase her pyro damage bonus by 2%, up to a maximum of 10 stacks with a 3-second timer on this buff. Since this skill says on hit and not when it deals damage, this means that if Yoimiya hits a shield, she will still increase her pyro damage bonus by 2%. At full stacks, she is going to have 20% pyro damage bonus. But in order to do this, you will need to complete 1 full combo, which is going to give you 7 stacks, and then get to the second hit of your second rotation for the remaining 3. Since this effect only lasts 3 seconds, any extended period of time you spend dodging, you are most likely going to lose your stacks. This is important because it's going to lead into her next passive skill. Yoimiya's passive 2 is related to her elemental burst. Using it will cause her party members to gain a 10% attack increase for 15 seconds. This does not include Yoimiya. A further attack bonus will be added based on the number of stacks she has from her E skill when casting her burst. Each stack gives an extra 1%. This means that with 10 stacks, we can have a total of 20% attack bonus to the team, which is equivalent to a 4-piece Noblesse Oblige bonus. But you need to ensure that you have your stacks, so try to make sure you aren't dodging for extended periods of time as your E skill winds down. The attack bonus lasts a very long time as well, more than enough for your team to take advantage, and it's also much longer than the 8 seconds of downtime for her E skill. This passive skill pretty much screams team support since it doesn't apply to herself, and her elemental burst also cannot even be triggered by herself. Basically at C0, Yoimiya wants to pop her skill, use her normal attacks to get stacks, and then immediately pop her burst if it's available to support the rest of the team. That's basically Yoimiya in a nutshell. And before we get into the calculations here, Yoimiya's choices for bows are as follows. The Battle Pass weapon, the Viridescent Hunt, which is a pretty good weapon if you are lacking in crit rate. The Blacklist series, which is also a pretty good weapon because it gives us crit damage, so if you're doing pretty good in the crit rate department, this is pretty decent. Rust, because it gives us a damage bonus to our normal attacks, and since her E skill is very much focused around this is pretty much built for that kind of playstyle. The Prototype Crescent can work, but it comes with a caveat in that you have to shoot a aimed shot at a weak point so that you can get the buff, and then you want to initiate your E skill and start spamming your normal attacks. The Windbloom Ode can be a decent option if you decide to go with an overload comp, and then the new craftable Inazuma bow is pretty decent and gives you an extra boost if you want to ignore Yoimiya's elemental burst. And then as for 5 stars, most of them are pretty good stat sticks, so the Skyward is a great choice because the crit rate is pretty good, the Amos bow just gives you tons of attack, and the new Thundering Pulse bow gives you a lot of crit damage as well as some decent damage bonus. That synergizes pretty well with her skills. We'll mostly just be looking at her 4 stars and perhaps a separate video for her 5-star weapons. So these calculations are done using a level 80 Yoimiya as well as level 8 talents and plus 20 artifacts. When looking at her weapons, the circlet that we use is going to depend on the secondary stat on the weapon. So if the weapon carries crit damage like the Blacklist series, then we use crit rate. But if the weapon has crit rate like the Battle Pass weapon, then we are going to use crit damage circlet. And if the weapon doesn't have any crit at all as its secondary stat, then we are going to run crit rate circlet. So what this pretty much means is that every single weapon that we look at here is going to have a crit rate of around 55%. There is also a very small amount of substats included in here to reflect people that are pretty unlucky in their artifact farming. So we have 3 rolls into attack percent and 3 rolls into crit damage percent, which gives us 17.4% extra attack bonus as well as 23.4% extra crit damage. So this gives us a pretty good idea of at least how much damage you should be doing, and with your builds with better substats, you guys are guaranteed to definitely do much more damage. Alright, so welcome to my spreadsheet. Because of the way Yoimiya's skill works, you can only get 1 stack with this when its max is 3, so in all the math here where I am running a 4-piece Crimson Witch set, we are only going to have 1 stack of the Crimson Witch buff, which is about 7.5% extra pyro damage bonus on top of the 15 from the 2-piece set. That's the important thing to know about that. Other than that, I think everything else is pretty standard. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tables, math, and charts. Okay, before we get too deep into this, let me just show you all of the different kinds of calculations we're gonna go through just as a quick overview so that you know what to expect. So first off, we're going to be doing some artifact comparisons, and what I'm doing here is using a Viridescent Hunt, as well as we are comparing 6 different artifact sets. So main DPS sets and then sets that are based around sub DPS. This first one is just looking at crit damage, and then the second one is looking at average damage. Moving on, we're going to take a look at realistic stacks. So what this means is that Yoimiya's E skill, you will not have 10 stacks at the start. So what this is doing is it is calculating the damage for each normal attack as you gain stacks while you do your normal attack. and I've kind of estimated it up to the point where you will spend 10 seconds doing your normal attacks. So I'm guesstimating that you'll probably be able to do about 2 full combos and then a little bit of your third combo. So probably up to your third normal attack before you run out of time. Included in that as well is if we were to vape each hit, but of course we have to remember the rules for elemental reactions. So that rule is kind of that attacks are grouped into sets of 3, or 2.5 seconds need to pass. So that means every third hit is going to vape, starting with the first. So the first hit, and then another one, and then another one, and then the fourth hit will vape, and then 2 more attacks, and then the following will vape. So this is what this section is for, a realistic rotation with vaporize thrown in there. Now, why not include melt? That's just because there isn't a character out there that can apply cryo fast enough right now, because Xingqiu does a pretty good job at applying hydro at a pretty fast rate. But still, like I said earlier, we're not 100% sure if that's possible yet. Yoimiya's attacks might be a little too quick, but this is under the assumption that it is possible. Next are weapon comparisons, and with this I'm using 2-piece Crimson Witch with 2-piece Gladiator, and again just looking at crit damage. You'll see why I'm only taking a look at crit damage, because the overall story between average damage and crit damage is pretty much the same. We can come to the same conclusion even if we just look at crit damage, and looking at just crit damage is a lot easier, as well as these are actually the numbers that you will see in game if you were to build your Yoimiya, as I am looking in my calculations. So the weapons that we're looking at are the Viridescent Hunt, the Blackcliff Warbow when it has 0 stacks and up to when it has 3, the Prototype Crescent and also when it has its buff, the Rust, and the new Inazuma Bow, the Hamayumi, as well as when it has its 100% energy buff. And then after that, we are going to be taking a look at practical rotations for 3 of her main DPS sets using the normal attack rotation that I calculated earlier up here with the realistic stacks. So this is going to give us a pretty decent representation of what a full rotation for her attack combo is going to look like. So her normal attack combo actually is gaining stacks and then casting her elemental burst. So included this is when we don't create any elemental reactions, and then when we create an elemental reactions just on our normal attacks, and then when we create elemental reactions on everything, if this is even possible. And then moving on, we are going to be doing more in-depth weapon comparisons where we are taking a look at more of just her practical rotations. So I removed the charge attacks, some of the more useless skills on her. Sorry to say that her charge attacks are useless, but for the most part you won't be using that. And I have also broken that out into vaporize and melt damage. When it comes to the melt though, we are not melting her normal attacks, so that is omitted. Just the elemental burst is getting melted. So this is probably more for a sub DPS playstyle, but I'm still using 2-piece Crimson Witch and 2-piece Gladiator for these comparisons. But the point of this is to compare the weapons and not the artifact set. And then coming down, we are also doing realistic stacks again, but instead of artifact sets, we are going to be taking a look at it with weapons. We are going to be looking at Viridescent Hunt, a Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks, Prototype Crescent with the buff, and Rust. Because you'll see when I do a deeper dive on this that those are the weapons that kind of do the most damage, but of course Blackcliff Warbow and Prototype Crescent with the buff are kind of awkward to play with. And then included in this as well is a vaporized version where we vape every first hit of a 3 set attack. We use that data to condense it into these comparison tables, which again, like before, is non-reaction, vaporize on our normals, and then vaporize on everything. Alright, so let's jump into the artifact comparison graphs now, and we're going to be taking a look at the comparisons for crit damage and average damage, and you're going to see that no matter what we look at, the story that these numbers and graphs are telling us is pretty much the same. And you'll also notice that we are graphing a whole lot of data, but don't worry, we'll get to practical stuff real soon. And again, you'll see that even though we are graphing every single thing, we still can make the same conclusion as long as we are thinking a little bit about what these graphs is actually graphing. So let's go ahead and start with the crit damage, and we can see that the 4-piece Shiminawa is the set that does the most overall damage, and following that is the 4-piece Crimson Witch set, and then following that is the 2-piece Gladiator with 2-piece Crimson Witch. And then the sub DPS sets do a little bit less damage, but they are more focused around dealing elemental burst damage. That means that their normal attack damage is going to be weaker, which is to be expected. And among those sub DPS sets, the 2-piece Noblesse and 2-piece Crimson Witch and the 2-piece Noblesse and 2-piece Gladiator, they deal pretty much the same damage, so you can't really go wrong with either one. Go with the set that has better substats. The 4-piece Severed Fate does slightly less damage than these two sets because the overall damage bonus is lower, because we only have 1.2 energy recharge or 120% energy recharge, so that damage bonus isn't enough to compete with Noblesse, because these give you 35% damage bonus versus just 30 damage bonus, and Noblesse and Gladiator gives you damage bonus and attack bonus. So that's why these do slightly better than a 4-piece Severed Fate when you don't have any other sources of energy recharge. And then if we go ahead and move over to the average damage comparisons, you'll see that we get the same story. 4-piece Shiminawa is doing the most damage, and then 4-piece Crimson Witch, and then the 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Crimson Witch set. And you'll also see that the damage difference between these three artifact sets is practically almost the same. So if I head to a percent difference calculator, you'll notice that the percent difference between crit damage and average damage is almost literally the same. 4.17% damage difference versus 4.16% damage difference. So this 193 and it's 185. That's the difference between a 4-piece Shiminawa and a 4-piece Crimson Witch. And then over here on this side, 141 and 136, as I've inputted here, is 4.16% damage difference. So doesn't really matter what we're looking at. Everything is pretty much still the same. With that said, going forward, I'm just going to be looking at crit damage because it's funner that way, because we get to see bigger numbers. But at the end of the day, we are still going to come to the same conclusion. Now, why is the 4-piece Crimson Witch set doing so much damage here as opposed to the 2-piece Gladiator and 4-piece Shiminawa? We shouldn't take this at face value. Because we're stacking up all of this damage, we need to be aware of what this graph is actually plotting. This is plotting a lot of useless stuff. So for example, it's plotting the charge shot and the kindling arrow, which we don't really care for. And it's also plotting all of the elemental reaction damage. So you'll notice that there is the burst, melt, burst, vaporize, and then normal attack, melt, and vaporize. So when we stack all of this together, there's a lot of things that aren't very practical in this. We can still get some pretty good information from this, but we shouldn't make our conclusion just yet. So far it is looking like 4-piece Shiminawa and 4-piece Crimson Witch are pretty good sets, and then the 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Crimson Witch is the worst out of them, but it's still not that bad. And really quickly here, let me just take a percent difference to see just how much worse it is so that we can just get a better picture of it. And the damage difference between Shiminawa and 2-piece Crimson Witch and 2-piece Gladiator is about 9.5% difference. So now moving down to this graph, this is a graph that plots the data based off of skill damage instead of stacking it. But there is a lot going on here, and quite honestly, it is very, very difficult to parse. But there are some patterns that we can see with this. Clearly, the 4-piece Shiminawa set is dealing the most normal attack damage. You'll notice that that blue bar is the highest for basically all of these things except for when it comes to burst damage. When it comes to burst damage, it is the lowest bar. And then for the 4-piece Crimson Witch set, it is the highest bar whenever we look at elemental reaction damage, which of course makes sense because the 4-piece Crimson Witch gives us 15% extra damage on those vaporize and melt elemental reactions. You'll notice that the yellow bar all the way here and all the way down here is quite high, but it still doesn't quite compete with the 4-piece Shiminawa set. The 4-piece Shiminawa set always pretty much always wins when it comes to normal attack damage, even when it comes to elemental reactions. And then the 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Crimson Witch set is just kind of in the middle everywhere. So it's just kind of like your average artifact set when we break it down by each part of her kit. So hopefully this is painting the picture a little bit better. The normal attacks from the Shiminawa set is really carrying it pretty far, and then the elemental reaction damage from the Crimson Witch is also carrying it pretty far. So if those are two things that you are going to be focusing on, then those two sets are pretty good. However, it should be noted that with the 4-piece Shiminawa set, you are going to be having some energy recharge problems because of that 15 energy drain whenever you activate your E skill. So it might actually be better to completely remove the elemental burst skill damage, because you're going to be draining your energy so much as Yoimiya running the 4-piece Shiminawa. So that's going to be a bigger damage loss. So you really do need to think hard about that. Since these graphs are so close to each other, removing the burst skill damage is going to be a very big damage loss, and you will definitely notice it if you're unable to cast your burst as often as the other artifact sets. Alright, so now let's go ahead and move on to the practical rotations. And remember how I explained this before, so hopefully you still remember how that works. And this is her normal attack combo with no reactions, with vaporized normal attacks, and with vaporized on every single part of her kit. So a practical rotation for Yoimiya is probably going to be normal attacks into her elemental burst. I don't think it really gets any more complicated than that. Excuse me. Use your elemental skill, normal attacks, and then pop your elemental burst. So we can see here that normal attack combos without elemental reactions. Clear winner here is the 4-piece Shiminawa when it comes to normal attack damage, with a total of about 102,000 damage. And then coming closely after that is a 2-piece Gladiator, 2-piece Crimson Witch, and then a 4-piece Crimson Witch. Here, the 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Crimson Witch wins out because we're not doing any elemental reactions. There's more damage bonus and better attack percent bonus with this set than the 4-piece Crimson Witch set. So without any elemental reactions, 4-piece Crimson Witch does the worst, which is expected. But how much worse is it? 124,000 versus 119,000. Let's go ahead and pop that into our percentage difference calculator and see how much worse it actually is. And the calculated difference is about 4.3% difference. So honestly, I think that's very negligible. I don't think you'll really see that much of a difference in your damage. Sure, it's different, but really not that different. So you can go with either one, to be completely honest with you. And then going back to the Shiminawa, remember that elemental bursts are going to be hard to cast with this set. So if we remove this yellow and red section for this artifact set, Shiminawa does the worst. 102,000 versus 124 and 119. Please consider that. So moving on to the vaporized normal attack graph, you'll see that the 4-piece Crimson Witch set pulls ahead, which is to be expected. It is just barely ahead though, 144,000 versus 142,000. So I don't think we even need to plug this into the percentage difference calculator, because this is definitely less than 5%. And then again with the Shiminawa set, even though that the normal attack damage is the strongest, you will not be able to cast elemental bursts as often. So it's going to be the worst artifact set. Now, don't get me wrong when I say worst, we're just speaking in a comparative sense. So without the damage from the elemental burst, the 4-piece Shiminawa set is going to struggle there. Next, moving on to the all vape practical rotation. So this means that if you are somehow able to vape every single proc on her elemental burst, then this is what is going to happen. So of course, the 4-piece Crimson Witch set is going to pull ahead here. And the 4-piece Shiminawa suffers the same problem. We should ignore the elemental burst damage because you're going to have issues casting it. And then the 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Crimson Witch is the second best. So we can go ahead and plug this into our percentage difference calculator and see how different these these two artifact sets are. And the damage difference between these two sets is 5.65%, 5.66%. So again, I think 5% damage difference is not that great of a damage difference, so you can't really go wrong with either one. I would choose whichever artifact set you find easier to farm or that you already have, or whichever has better substats. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into our weapon comparisons. So with these graphs, I removed the charge attack and the kindling arrow damage because that damage is largely useless, and then I also removed the elemental reaction damage just so that we could get a clearer picture with these graphs. We'll get into the elemental reaction damage in a little bit. So what is the graph telling us here? The graph is telling us there are a couple of pretty good weapon choices to go with here. What I see here is that the Viridescent Hunt is kind of in the middle of the pack. The Blackcliff Warbow is a decent choice, only if you can get stacks with it. Personally, I think that getting stacks with this weapon is pretty hard, and it's not really a consistent or reliable passive skill on it. So for the most part, you'll be relying on 0 stacks or 1 stack. If you were to go with that, then the Warbow is a little bit underperforming with no stacks, but then it kind of competes with everything else with 1 stack. And of course, if you're able to get 3 stacks, then it is the highest damaging weapon. But again, that's pretty hard to do. The Prototype Crescent was a very nice surprise. With no buff, obviously, it's not going to do very well, but with the buff, it actually competes pretty nicely with the Viridescent Hunt, Blackcliff Warbow, the Rust, and the new Hamayumi Inazuma craftable bow weapon. However, getting this buff is quite awkward because you have to shoot a charge shot on a weak point in order to get the buff. So when you take the time to do that, you're probably going to get a damage loss. But in terms of just pure numbers, yeah, Prototype Crescent does damage that is on par with a lot of other weapons. And then when it comes to Rust, yeah, it pretty much does the best out of everything because we are totally going to ignore the 2-stack and 3-stack Blackcliff Warbow. So, but it's just barely ahead. 48,000, 47,000, 47,000, 46,000. And then for the new forgeable bow without its buff, it's not quite on the level of the other weapons, but with its buff, it kind of competes pretty well with it. But if you want to keep uptime on this buff, that means you aren't casting your elemental burst, which means you're losing out on damage. Unless you can start your E skill with 100% energy, then that's a different story. But I think that those situations are not the easiest to come by. So it's situational. So what I'm gathering from this graph is that your most consistent weapons are going to be the Rust and the Viridescent Hunt and maybe the Blackcliff Warbow. Prototype Crescent with the buff is really awkward to use, and the Hamayumi is very situational. And then if we move over to this graph where we don't stack it up, personally I don't really see a difference, and this kind of graph is kind of just harder to parse, but you can see that each of these graphs looks exactly the same. The way that these bars are positioned are pretty much almost exactly the same, except for the Rust. So you'll see that with Rust, you'll see that the yellow and the green bars kind of go up, and that's because we're getting a damage bonus on that. So it does slightly more damage than her elemental burst. Whereas with every other weapon, elemental burst damage does more damage than the first and second normal attack for Yoimiya. Same thing with the Hamayumi. Since it also gives you a damage bonus to charged and normal attacks, you'll notice that the yellow and green bars are a little bit higher here than the elemental burst damage. But that's pretty much the only difference that we see in this graph, so the conclusion is pretty much the same. Now let's go ahead and look at vaporized damage, and again, the story is the same. Viridescent Hunt, Blackcliff Warbow, Prototype Crescent, Rust, Hamayumi. All those weapons do pretty much the same amount of damage, and that would make sense since none of these weapons really increase the damage of elemental reactions, so of course we wouldn't really see any kind of change. The only way we're going to see a change is if we change this to a practical rotation, because the Rust is going to get more damage since there is damage bonus on normal attacks. And we'll also see that for the Hamayumi weapon. So until we move on to that graph, we're going to see the same story throughout all of these. We can go ahead and move over to mount, where we mount the elemental burst damage. And again, same story: Viridescent Hunt, Blackcliff Warbow, Prototype Crescent, Rust, and Hamayumi. But you'll notice that there is a slightly bigger gap here, just slightly, between Prototype Crescent with the buff and the Rust. And that's simply because the elemental burst damage from these weapons are a little bit stronger than the Rusts. So that's why we're seeing a little bit more of an increase on the Prototype Crescent here and the Viridescent Hunt, and why the Rust seems to be lagging. But again, we are coming to the conclusion that Rust and Viridescent Hunt are the best weapons due to consistency. Alright, now let's go ahead and move on to our practical rotation weapon comparisons. And with this, I'm only going to be looking at 4 weapons, just so that we don't oversaturate the graph. And we're taking a look at the Viridescent Hunt, Prototype Crescent with the buff, Rust, and the Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks. And now, why Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks? Just because it was the best performing weapon under ideal conditions. Remember, that is ideal conditions, and managing 3 stacks is pretty hard. Even though it was the highest damaging weapon, it is probably not something that you'll be seeing very often. And so putting it here and then comparing it to our other weapons, you'll see just how much of a difference the damage is. So this first one contains no elemental reactions, and Viridescent Hunt, Prototype Crescent, and the Rust, they're all doing pretty much the same amount of damage. The Prototype Crescent with the buff is dealing the least with 123,000. Viridescent Hunt is the next with 124, and Rust is the best with 125. But that is all very small damage differences, so you can't really go wrong with anything. And then the Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks is at 136. So what is the actual damage difference here? Let's go ahead and plug that into our calculator. So between the Blackcliff Warbow and the Rust, there is a 8.5% total damage difference if we are including all of our normal attacks and her elemental burst damage. And then between the Viridescent Hunt and the Rust, there is a less than 1% damage difference. So choosing between the Rust and Viridescent Hunt is almost nothing, if I'm being completely honest, if the practical rotation that I'm looking at is actually accurate or not. Now, if you just wanted to look at normal attack damage, then the damage difference is a little bit less. 93,000 and 91,000 if we were just comparing normal attacks. That damage difference is certainly going to be less. So out of curiosity's sake, let's go ahead and see what that is. That damage difference is only 2.5%. So the addition of the elemental burst damage is quite significant, and like I said before, you really should not ignore this damage. Next is if we vaporize her normal attacks, but not her elemental burst, and everything is pretty much the same. Rust here is doing the best, followed by Viridescent Hunt, and then Prototype Crescent, and then Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks takes the lead. Let's go ahead and plug this into our percentage difference calculator to see if anything significant changes. So a little bit, there is 1% less, so we are now at 7.8% damage difference when we vaporize her normal attacks. So Rust does a little bit better here, but it's just 1% more. And then just looking at the damage difference between normal attacks only, there is a 2.4% damage difference. So looking at these two numbers, the 107.59 and the 109.682, that is about 2.5% damage difference. Moving on to where we vaporize everything, I imagine that the Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks pulls ahead a little bit more because that vaporized damage is going to be pretty strong. So between the Rust and Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks, we are losing about 9.5% damage difference, which is pretty much around 10%. But again, I'm going to say this a lot. Blackcliff Warbow with 3 stacks is pretty hard to maintain and is very situational. So Rust, just for its consistency, is probably going to be your best option. Followed very closely by the Viridescent Hunt, which actually here does very slightly more damage, just by a couple hundred. And this is due in part because the elemental reaction damage from her elemental burst is stronger than the Rust's. So you'll see that if we can vaporize all 5 of her elemental burst hits, it does slightly more damage than the Rust. So that's why Viridescent Hunt is pulling ever so slightly ahead in this graph. And then quickly going back here, you'll see that the elemental burst damage for the Viridescent Hunt is also stronger than the Rust's. So we can take a look at those 3 graphs again, but in a different manner where we don't stack the damage, because I know that some people just don't like looking at graphs that are stacked, so we can go ahead and take a look at it this way. And to be honest with you, I think we come to the same conclusion. Rust here is going to do the best when it comes to normal attacks, and it just slightly underperforms the Blackcliff Warbow, but the elemental burst damage from the Rust is the weakest among all 3. And no matter how we slice it, that is generally the same idea here. So with vaporized normal attacks, it is pretty high up there, just slightly underperforming the Blackcliff Warbow. The elemental reaction damage here is quite weaker. And the same exact story over here. Normal attack damage is pretty high, but elemental burst reaction damage is quite low. But at the end of the day, for consistency and ease of use, your 2 best options are hands down going to be the Viridescent Hunt and the Rust. You can definitely go with the other options if you have already leveled them up, because really their damage is quite similar. That's pretty much all that I have for you guys in terms of calculations. So with all of this information that I presented to you, I hope that this helps you make a decision on whether or not you want to pull for Yoimiya. And now I just want to give you my final thoughts on the character. Everything that I'm going to be saying here is completely opinion, so please don't get mad if it's different from yours. I love Yoimiya's design, don't get me wrong. I think she is super cute, and I think her animations are probably one of the coolest among the Pyro characters, probably second to Hu Tao's butterfly effects. But I think that Yoimiya is going to be a very niche character, and it's going to be more focused on her sub DPS and support role. I think as a main DPS character, she is going to be a little bit lacking just because she lacks that AoE damage. In certain matchups where we only fight one enemy, she will definitely be a good choice, but matchups where we only fight one enemy is very rare. So in more common use cases, we'll probably be seeing her being used for her elemental burst and her attack boost. What is unfortunate, however, with that is that you have to spend 10 seconds shooting your arrows in order to get the 20% attack bonus to give to your teammates. I also hope that they increase the size of the AoE on her elemental burst so that it has an easier time hitting multiple enemies. But of course, don't let this stop you from playing your favorite character in the main DPS role and on the field as much as you want. You can use Yoimiya in the overworld because you're definitely not going to be having any issues there. But when it comes to harder content like Spiral Abyss and event challenges, Yoimiya is probably going to be better suited in the support role, or if the matchup only has one enemy. Anyway guys, this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. This one took a really long time to make. The calculations for Yoimiya were absolutely insane, especially with the vaporized stuff, so a like would be super appreciated. And if you share this with your friends who are thinking about pulling Yoimiya, this would also help me out a ton. Anyway guys, don't forget to leave a comment down below and maybe subscribe to the channel if you liked what you saw. And until next time, I will see you guys later.